going to discuss another very important topic, that is ignition system. Okay. As far as the ignition system it is concerned, it is nothing but the combustion of the fuel. As the combustion in broadly we can describe, combustion is a process whereby the oxygen from the atmosphere will combine with carbon from the fuel to produce carbon dioxide by generating heat. This is called combustion process. And again, I will repeat once again the combustion process. The combustion process, once again, I am repeating here. It is the process whereby the oxygen from the atmosphere will combine with carbon from the fuel to produce carbon dioxide. During this process, enormous amount of heat energy is released. This is called the combustion energy. Okay, fine. Your this thing will be answered. And again, as far as the internal combustion engine is concerned, as the name itself indicates, the combustion of the fuel will take place inside the engine cylinder. This is what. And another type of is the external combustion engine, whereby the combustion of fuel will take place outside the engine cylinder. This is again in combustion. We have two types of combustion. One is complete combustion, another one is incomplete combustion. As far as the complete combustion is concerned, whereby the carbon portion of the fuel completely combined with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide. If the exhaust involved everything of carbon dioxide, then it is said to be complete combustion. Normally, it is difficult to have that. Incomplete combustion is concerned, as we know, the combustion may not be complete. All the exhaust will not have the complete carbon dioxide component, which involves some percentage of carbon monoxide in the exhaust, will be said as incomplete combustion. And our objective is to achieve very closely towards complete combustion. And now coming to this ignition system is concerned. Okay, generally we have two types of engines. One is petrol engine, one is diesel engine. Petrol engine is called spark ignition engine. Diesel engine is called compression ignition engine. And in case of spark ignition engine or petrol engine, the ignition of the fuel will take place at the end of combustion, at the end of compression stroke. In case of this thing, at the end of compression stroke. Okay, so again, just I will give a brief history about how the petrol engine will work. Petrol engine, during the suction process, proportionate mixture of petrol and diesel is inducted into the engine cylinder from the carburetor through the open inlet valve. This happens during the suction process, and during process, at the end of compression process, spark is produced. A high temperature spark will be produced with the help of spark plug, which initiates the combustion of fuel, which initiates the ignition of compressed charge inside the engine cylinder, will happen in spark ignition engines. Okay, now coming to compression ignition engines. During compression ignition engines or diesel engines, during the suction process, air alone is inducted into the engine cylinder through the inlet valve. And air will be inducted during the suction process, and after completion of the suction process, air which is already been inducted into the engine cylinder will be compressed. And this compression will take place during the compression process, during the upward movement of piston from BDC to TDC. At the end of compression of air during this compression stroke, the temperature and pressure achieved by the air will be too high, and at the end of compression stroke, diesel is injected into the engine cylinder in the form of fine spray particles through the fuel injector. Okay, here fuel injector will act as a dividing particle, and the fuel will be injected, diesel will be injected at the end of compression stroke in the form of fine spray particle through the fuel injector for a particular crank angle rotation. And as soon as diesel enters into the engine cylinder, it gets ignited because of the temperatures and pressures which is achieved by the compression process. And rest of the process, this is what is this? Rest process will take place whereby the power will be produced. This is called power process, and the exhaust will take place. This is how the ignition. Now, presently, we are going to concentrate more on spark ignition engines. Here, as far as the ignition system is concerned, as I said, it is nothing but combustion. Ignition system is one of the most important systems used in IC engines. The spark ignition engine requires some device to ignite the compressed air fuel mixture. The additional component what we are using is spark plug. At the end of this compression, this spark plug will produce high intensity, high temperature spark, which is sufficient enough to ignite the compressed air petrol mixture during the compression process. Okay, the ignition takes place inside the cylinder at the end of the compression stroke. At the end of the compression stroke, what happens? High intensity, high temperature spark is produced by the spark plug, which is sufficient enough to ignite the mixture of fuel and air. Okay. Ignition system generates a spark. As I said, the spark plug. It is an additional heating component which is required only in case of petrol engine. The ignition system generates a spark or heats the electrode, okay, to a high temperature to ignite the air fuel mixture in petrol engine or the gas-fired engines. Okay. The purpose of this ignition system is to generate a very high voltage. The purpose of this ignition system is to generate a high voltage from 12-volt battery to more than 30,000 volt battery, so that the spark will be produced, the high intensity spark will be produced by the spark plug, which is sufficient to ignite the compressed charge. What is the compressed charge? Air and petrol mixture, which is going to happen at the end of compression process. This is overall as far as the ignition system is concerned. Ignition system, it is one of the very important system in internal combustion engine. The objective of this ignition system is to ignite the compressed charge, air and petrol mixture, with the help of a spark, which is produced by the spark plug at the end of compression stroke or compression process. Okay, this is how ignition. It plays very important role. If the ignition is complete, if the ignition is taking place in the predetermined duration, if the ignition happens as short as duration, so that more and more work is generated. Once more and more work is delivered by the engine, so that more power will be obtained, so that efficiency also increases. Another point, the combustion efficiency plays very important role. What is the combustion efficiency? The fuel efficiency. As soon as spark is produced, the compressed charge should be get ignited within shortest possible time, so as to have better fuel efficiency, so that more heat energy is generated in the combustion chamber. Once when the more heat energy is generated in the combustion chamber, more work is done by the cylinder. Once when the more work is done by the cylinder, more power output by the cylinder. Once when the fuel efficiency is better, volumetric efficiency increases, combustion efficiency increases, so that the overall efficiency also increases along with increased power output. This is possible by having the ignition of the charge at the shortest possible time after production of the spark by the spark plug. This is the better quality of a spark ignition system. I hope you understand this. And what are the major functions of this ignition system? The ignition system, see, for producing the high intensity spark, high temperature spark, high tension voltage is required at the spark electrodes, at the spark gap. Okay, so I think you must have seen the spark plug. At the bottom of the spark plug, there is called electrode. There is small, that figure I will show you. There will be small gap. That gap, it is called spark gap. So generally the spark gap, it is of the 0.9 millimeter to 1.8 millimeter according to the requirement of the engine. Okay, in that spark gap, to produce the spark, very high tension voltage is required. The voltage may be even of the order of 30,000 and more volts, so that the spark will be produced. The high intensity spark is produced at the spark plug. Okay, so ignition system will produce high tension voltage of the order of 30,000 volts is applied across the spark electrodes, and thereby the current jumps from one electrode to another electrode for producing a spark across the spark plug. Generally, this ignition system, okay, there are two ignition systems which we are going to discuss. There are three ignition systems which we are going to discuss. Okay, one is battery ignition system, another one is magneto ignition system, another one is electronic ignition system. And the main objective of all these will for producing the spark across the spark plug by the spark plug. So very high tension voltage is required. Again, I'm repeating, the main function of this ignition system is it produces high tension voltage of the order of 30,000 volts, which is applied across the spark electrodes. Once after production of this high tension voltage, the current, the high voltage current jumps from one electrode to another, producing a high intensity. So we were discussing about the functions of the ignition system, and we know what is ignition system. Ignition system is nothing but the burning of fuel in presence of air with the help of an external source or with the help of the self ignition. Which self ignition we are looking in case of compression ignition system, whereas external heating element it is required in case of spark ignition system. And now presently we are concentrating, and we are going to concentrate on the ignition system relevant to spark ignition or petrol engines. Here, so already we discussed, so the better quality of an ignition system, Once when the compression stroke is completed, once when the compression of petrol and air is completed during the compression stroke, at the end of compression, high intensity, high temperature spark which is produced at the spark plug has to ignite the compressed charge at the shortest possible time. This is called a better ignition in case of spark ignition system. And so achieve this, the ignition system has to do certain functions. So as to have a better spark, so as to have a faster ignition, so as to produce more work, so as to improve the efficiency, so as to improve the power output of the engine. The ignition system has to produce high tension voltage of the order of 30,000 volts and above. I'm talking of, okay. Generally, this process will be done with the help of a induction coil that we are going to discuss. The ignition system has to produce a high tension voltage of the order of 30,000 volts and above. Whatever the volt which is high voltage generated is applied across the spark electrodes, and this high voltage, high tension voltage current jumps from one electrode. See, whatever the high tension voltage which is produced, this high tension voltage current jumps from one electrode to another for producing the spark across the spark plug gap. Okay, and see, the high intensity, I'm talking of high temperature. The temperature of the spark should be 500 to 800 degrees Celsius. Then only it is possible to have a faster ignition. And even I was quoting the length of the spark gap, which you can see at the bottom of the spark, which I am going to show you. If you should have seen in the practical case also, the spark gap length should be in between 0.9 to 1.5 millimeters. Okay, so what happens if the spark plug, if the spark gap is below 0.9, is above 1.5 millimeter? We'll discuss what happens. Okay, and the ignition system has to distribute the high voltage spark which is produced to each spark plug in correct sequence. Remember, particularly this spark ignition system and generally this battery ignition system or magneto ignition system or electronic ignition system, these are preferred in case of multi-cylinder engines. For example, if we look into 4-cylinder engines, each cylinder will have one spark plug. Okay, whatever the high tension voltage which is produced has to jump over each spark plug which is connected to each cylinder. So that is the function of this high voltage has to be distributed to each spark plug and to each spark gap so as to produce the spark. And the timing of the spark should be very, very important. Okay, the timing of spark, at what duration spark should be produced, it plays very important parameter in this ignition system. The timing of the spark should be so that the spark should be produced as the piston is nearing to top dead center position. Okay, so what happens during compression process? Piston will be moving from bottom dead center position to top dead center position. Okay, so generally, theoretically speaking, the spark has to be produced once when the piston reaches the top dead center position. But in actual practice, we will design the engine in such a way that the spark has to be produced. The spark should happen. The spark should occur as the piston is nearing to top dead center position. That means the spark has to be produced before piston reaches the top dead center position. This is very important. Timing the spark and the occurrence of the spark, it plays very important role as far as the ignition system is concerned. Okay, and the spark timing, it is related to load which is acting on the engine, the speed of the engine, and other conditions. Okay, the spark timing can be varied according to the load which is acting on the engine, according to the speed which is acting on the engine, and other conditions. This is the function of the ignition system. Okay, again I will repeat the function of ignition system. Ignition system will has to produce a high tension voltage of the order of 30,000 volts or above, and this high tension volt which is produced has to be applied across the spark electrodes, and whatever the high tension voltage which is generated by the induction coil, which we are going to discuss, the high tension voltage which is produced, this high tension voltage current jumps from one electrode to another for producing the spark across the spark gap of the spark plug. And here again I will repeat, the spark gap and its length, it plays important role, and the temperature of the spark, it plays important role for better ignition in the engine. Okay, generally the spark gap length, it should be 0.9 millimeter to 1.6 millimeters. If it is above 1.6 millimeter, below 0.9 millimeter, this gap will produce a poorer ignition in the engine cylinder. Okay, and the length is decided based on again the three parameters: load acting on the engine, the maximum load designed by the engine, the maximum speed of the engine design, and other materials which are used for the engine. And another important function of this ignition system is whatever the high tension voltage which is produced has to be distributed, okay, to each spark plug in case of multi-cylinder engines in correct sequence according to the firing order, okay. And another point has to be taken care here: timing the spark is very important in case of ignition system, very important. Okay, theoretically speaking, the spark has to be produced once when the piston reaches top dead center position, but it is not the case in actual practice. In actual practice, engines are designed so that the timing of the spark has to be produced before the piston reaches the top dead center position. And the timing of spark, it is proportional to load acting on the engine, speed of the engine, and other parameters which influence the overall performance of the engine. The timing of the spark can be varied with load of the engine, with speed of the engine, and other conditions of the engine which are going to influence over the overall performance of the engine. These are the major functions of the ignition system in spark ignition engines, in petrol engines. Spark ignition engine, petrol engine, Otto cycle engine, these are all same. Even the gas engine also, it is same. Okay, what are the components involved in ignition system? Basic components involved. Okay, so you can see on the screen, battery, it is one of the component. Ignition switch, this is another component. ignition coil. This is another component. This ignition coil is also called as induction coil. Another name for this ignition coil is induction coil. And another component, switching device. Another component, switching device. Another component is spark plug. Another component is spark plug. And one more component is ignition system wires. And wiring, ignition system wiring starting from battery to the spark gap. Okay, this is called ignition system wiring. Okay, so these are the major components associated with this as far as this thing is concerned. Okay. Batteries one, ignition switch is another component. Without any, all components together constitute the ignition system in case of spark ignition engine. If one is missing, then everything goes wrong. Battery, ignition switch, ignition coil. Ignition coil is also called induction coil. Switching device, spark plug, ignition system wires. Ignition system wires, again I will repeat, the wiring starting from grounding of battery to the wire which reaches the spark gap. This is called ignition system wiring. Okay, I hope this also you understood. Basic ignition systems. Basic ignition systems. Okay, basic, you can see here. Battery is there, one system. And you can see ignition switch is there. You can see. Okay, you can see the ignition coil. You can see ignition coil or induction coil. You can see the switching device. You can see the switching device. And battery, it is grounded. Switching device, it is also grounded. And spark plug, you can see. And you can see the electric spark in the spark gap. You can see this thing. Okay, these are the important basic ignition system, a basic layout you can see here. Okay, and generally the battery supplies power to entire system. Battery is the one, okay, which supplies the required power to entire system. As far as the battery is concerned, we have two kinds of battery which are used in practice. One is lead acid battery and another one is alkaline battery. These are the two kinds of battery which are used, which are presently used. Battery, it supplies the required power to the entire system. Okay, and two types of battery which are used presently. One is lead acid battery and another one is alkaline battery used. And lead acid battery, it is used in light duty commercial vehicles. Okay, lead acid battery, it is used in case of, you can see in case of light duty means all kinds of cars. All kinds of cars, lead acid battery, it is used. And alkaline battery, it is used in case of heavy duty commercial vehicles. What do you mean by heavy duty commercial vehicles? The heavy duty commercial vehicles in the sense bulldozer, trucks, and defense vehicles, aircraft vehicles, whereby for heavy duty engines alkaline battery is used, and for light duty vehicles like car, all kinds of car, lead acid battery it is used. Okay, and battery supplies the required power to the entire system. And again in battery, two types of battery it is used. One is 6-volt battery, whether it may be lead acid or alkaline. 6-volt battery or 12-volt battery, it is used according to the application of engine. according to the application of engine. Okay, and second one, you can see ignition switch. You can see ignition switch. As far as the ignition switch is concerned, so this switch is used to make the engine on or off. The ignition switch, once when it is turned, it will on. When it is turned off, it will be off. Ignition switch is used by the driver. Ignition switch is used by the driver to make engine on and off. To make engine on and off. To make engine on and off. And another one, you can see ignition coil. Ignition coil, it is nothing but a transformer. Ignition coil, it is nothing but a transformer. I said ignition coil is nothing but induction coil. Induction coil is a transformer. It steps up the voltage. Okay, it receives either 6-volt battery or 12-volt power from the battery, and it steps up this 6 or 12-volt battery into 20 to 30,000 volts current, which is required for producing the spark at the spark plug. This ignition coil will act as a transformer. It steps up the voltage from low volt to the higher volt required by the spark plug for producing the high intensity spark. High intensity spark. Okay. And one more thing here, you can see the switching device. You can see the switching device. Switching device, it triggers the ignition coil. It triggers the ignition coil. See how it triggers. Okay. So once when the power is given from the battery to the ignition coil as input, low voltage, there the magnetic field is produced. By switching on this contact breaker of the switching device, the power again goes back to the battery. During this process, whatever the magnetic flux or whatever the magnetic field which is produced, it collapses. By collapsing this magnetic flux, the low voltage, it is converted to the higher voltage of the order of 20 to 30,000 volt. Okay, switching device is used to act as a triggering device for collapsing the magnetic field which is produced by the ignition coil for producing the higher voltage. For producing the higher voltage. Okay. And here one more thing, a capacitor will be there. It is connected to the switching device, which you cannot see here in this figure. Next, where you can see the function of this capacitor. Capacitor, it prevents the burning of this switching device, the contact breaker points. The capacitor is used to prevent the pitting or burning of the contact breaker. See, you can see one straight line and one angular line. These two are called the points, contact breaker points. Okay. Once when they are connected to each other, they have contact, magnetic field is collapsed. Once when the contact is removed, again power is entered into the induction coil, magnetic field is produced. Again it collapses for producing the higher voltage. Okay, so these are the very important, again I will repeat, battery